All right, welcome to another deep dive. We're going to be tackling a pretty fascinating subject today, and with a real intellectual heavyweight, Ludwig von Mises.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to be exploring his critique of Marxist thought, as it's laid out in his work, Marxism Unmasked, or Marxism Unmasked.
Right.
I've got to say, just reading the title gets me intrigued.
Yeah, it's definitely a provocative title, and the book itself does not disappoint.
Yeah.
You know, even if Marx believed that history is driven by material productive forces, things like tools and technology.
Okay.
He argued that these forces determine social relations and even shape our thoughts and beliefs.
So it's like saying the invention of the printing press inevitably led to the Reformation because it changed how information was spread and who had access to it.
That's a great example.
Okay.
But Mises saw a major flaw in this line of thinking.
Okay.
If ideas are merely products of economic conditions, then how can Marxism itself, a set of ideas, claim to be an objective truth?
Right.
It creates a sort of intellectual catch-22.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It really challenges the very foundation of Marx's worldview.
Yeah.
Did Mises offer any real-world examples to illustrate this contradiction?
He did. He recounts a fascinating anecdote about visiting a school in Mexico that was officially designated as socialist. The director proudly explained that they taught Darwinian evolution and dialectical materialism as mandated by law. However, he casually mentioned that 90% of the teachers were devout Catholics.
Wow, that's pretty stark disconnect between the ideology being imposed and the reality on the ground.
Exactly. It highlights the limitations of a purely materialistic view of history.
Yeah.
Mises argued that ideas have their own power and influence independent of economic conditions.
Yeah.
He pointed out that tools and technology, the very things Marx claimed drove history, don't just appear out of thin air.
Right.
They are the products of human ingenuity, creativity, and innovation.
So in a sense, Mises puts human agency back at the center of the story.
Yeah.
It's not just about economic forces blindly pushing us along.
Right.
It's about the choices we make and the ideas that guide those choices.
Precisely. And this is just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, wow.
Mises delves into many other aspects of Marxist thought, including the concept of class struggle, the role of ideology, and the very feasibility of a socialist economic system.
This is already getting me thinking in a whole new way. For our listeners, be sure to stick around as we continue to unpack Mises's compelling critique of Marxist thought. Okay, so we've established that Mises saw some serious problems with Marx's materialistic view of history.
Right.
Where does his critique go from there?
Well, another key element of Marxist thought is this idea of class struggle as the driving force of history.
Right.
Marx believed that society is fundamentally divided between those who own the means of production,
Okay.
the bourgeoisie,
Right.
and those who labor for them,
Right.
the proletariat.
Right, the classic haves and have-nots.
Exactly.
Marx argued that this conflict would inevitably lead to revolution and the establishment of a socialist society. But how did Mises challenge this idea?
Well, one of Mises' main points of contention was with Marx's very definition of class.
Okay.
He pointed out that Marx never clearly defined what constituted a class, making it a very slippery concept.
So Mises is essentially saying that Marx is using this powerful word but without any real precision.
Exactly. And this vagueness makes it nearly impossible to use class as a meaningful analytical tool for understanding society.
Yeah.
It becomes more of a rhetorical device than a rigorous concept.
It seems like that lack of clarity could create a lot of room for misinterpretation and even manipulation.
Absolutely. Mises also took aim at Marx's theory of ideology.
Okay.
Marx argued that our thoughts and beliefs are shaped by our class position.
Okay.
In other words, the ideas of the ruling class become the ruling ideas of society.
So if you're a member of the working class, your ideas are essentially predetermined by your economic circumstances. Doesn't that leave very little room for individual thought or free will?
That's one of the key problems Mises identified.
Yeah.
He pointed out a pretty significant contradiction in this theory.
Okay.
If all thought is determined by class interests, then how can any class, including the proletariat, claim to have access to objective truth?
It's like saying no one can be truly objective because everyone is biased by their social position.
Right.
But wouldn't that apply to Marx himself? He was writing from a particular social and historical context, right?
Precisely. Mises argued that this self-contradiction undermines the entire Marxist framework.
Wow.
It calls into question the very possibility of a class-conscious proletariat leading a revolution based on objective truth and justice.
That's a pretty devastating critique.
It is.
But Marx wasn't just a philosopher. He also made some very specific economic predictions. How did Mises address those?
He tackled them head-on.
Okay.
For example, Marx predicted that capitalism would inevitably lead to the impoverishment of the working class.
Right.
He believed that wages would be driven down to subsistence levels as capitalists sought to maximize their profits.
That's a pretty bleak outlook, but it doesn't seem to have played out that way in many capitalist societies.
Exactly. Mises argued that Marx's prediction was demonstrably false.
Okay.
He pointed out that capitalism, while not perfect, actually creates the conditions for widespread prosperity. He saw that mass production, driven by the pursuit of profit, leads to lower prices and greater accessibility of goods and services for everyone, including the working class.
So instead of workers becoming increasingly impoverished, they actually become consumers who drive economic growth through their demand.
Precisely. And this is where Mises' understanding of free market economics really shines.
Okay.
He saw that competition among businesses incentivizes them to innovate, improve efficiency, and ultimately cater to the needs and desires of consumers.
So in Mises' view, the pursuit of profit within a framework of fair competition and respect for property rights can actually be a force for good.
Yes.
It encourages businesses to create better products and services for everyone.
That's the essence of his argument, and this brings us to one of Mises' most powerful and influential critiques of socialism.
Okay.
The idea that rational economic calculation is impossible under a centrally planned system.
Okay, this is where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah.
I've heard a lot about this argument, but I'm not sure I fully grasp it.
It's a complex idea, but I think we can break it down in a way that makes sense.
Okay.
Essentially, Mises argued that without private property and a free market, there's no way to accurately determine the value of goods and services.
So if the government controls all the means of production and sets prices, how can they possibly know what the real value of something is?
That's the crux of the problem.
Okay.
In a free market, prices emerge organically from the interactions of millions of buyers and sellers.
Right.
These prices act as signals, conveying crucial information about supply and demand.
So like if the price of coffee goes up,
Yeah.
it means more people want coffee or there's less of it available.
Right.
And this information tells coffee producers whether to grow more beans or maybe switch to a different crop.
Exactly. That's the beauty of the free market system.
Okay.
It allows for a constant process of adjustment based on these price signals.
Right.
Producers can use this information to make rational decisions about what to produce, how much to produce, and how to produce it efficiently.
But under socialism, the government doesn't have these market signals to guide them.
Precisely. And that's where the system starts to break down.
Wow.
Without a market for resources like labor and capital, there's no way to determine their relative value.
Right.
It's like trying to bake a cake without knowing how much flour or sugar to use.
Yeah.
You might end up with a big mess.
Right. A big mess.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how this could lead to some serious problems.
Yeah.
If the government can't accurately calculate the value of resources, how can they make rational decisions about how to allocate them?
They can't. And this leads to all sorts of economic inefficiencies, shortages, surpluses, and misallocations of resources.
Oh, wow.
Mises argued that a socialist economy is like a ship trying to sail without a compass.
Oh.
You might have a destination in mind, but without a way to navigate, you're likely to end up lost at sea.
And history seems to bear this out.
Yep.
Right? We've seen time and time again that centrally planned economies struggle with shortages, inefficiencies, and low standards of living.
Absolutely. The Soviet Union is a prime example.
Right.
Despite its vast resources, it was plagued by chronic shortages of basic goods, long lines, and a stagnant economy.
Right.
Mises' arguments were seen by many as a powerful explanation for why socialist systems so often fail to deliver on their promises.
So if Mises is right and economic calculation under socialism is truly impossible, what does that mean for those who are seeking a more just and equitable society? Does it mean we're stuck with capitalism, warts and all?
That's a great question, and one that Mises himself grappled with.
Yeah.
He certainly saw the flaws and limitations of capitalism.
Yeah.
But he believed that a free market system within a framework of limited government and the rule of law offered the best hope for human flourishing.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about. For our listeners, be sure to join us for the final part of our exploration of Mises' critique of Marxism, where we'll delve into his thoughts on money, inflation, and the role of government in the economy. Welcome back to our deep dive into Ludwig von Mises' critique of Marxist thought. So far, we've covered some pretty dense territory. The materialistic conception of history, class struggle, ideology and the problem of economic calculation under socialism.
Right.
I'm sensing a theme here.
Yeah.
Mises wasn't exactly a fan of centralized planning, was he?
Not really, no.
He saw some fundamental flaws in the idea of a centrally planned economy.
Right.
But his critique goes beyond just pointing out the practical problems he delved into, the very nature of money credit and the dangers of government intervention in these areas.
Yeah.
That's what I find so fascinating about Mises. He wasn't just an economist.
Right.
He was a philosopher of economics. He was trying to understand the underlying principles that govern human action and how those principles play out in the real world. So let's talk about money.
Okay.
What were Mises' main concerns there?
One of his biggest concerns was inflation.
Yeah.
He saw inflation as a form of theft, a way for governments to stealthily devalue the currency and erode the purchasing power of people's savings.
It's like a hidden tax that most people don't even realize they're paying.
Exactly. And he believed that inflation was often the result of governments trying to manipulate the money supply to achieve certain political goals. For example, they might print more money to finance government spending or try to artificially lower interest rates to stimulate economic growth.
We've seen this happen quite a bit in recent years, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
I mean, governments around the world have been pumping trillions of dollars into their economies through quantitative easing and other measures.
Precisely. And Mises would argue that this kind of intervention is ultimately unsustainable and creates more problems than it solves. He believed that artificially lowering interest rates through credit expansion creates a dangerous illusion of abundance. It makes it seem like there's more capital available for investment than there really is.
So businesses and consumers are encouraged to borrow and spend more, leading to an economic boom.
Right.
But it's all built on a foundation to stand.
Yeah. That's the danger Mises identified, he argued, that these artificially low interest rates lead to malinvestments, businesses making decisions based on distorted price signals, investing in projects that wouldn't be profitable under normal market conditions.
And when the inevitable correction comes, it can be quite painful.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw that with the housing bubble and the financial crisis of 2008.
Yes. That's a classic example of what Mises was warning about.
Yeah.
He was a staunch advocate for sound money, preferably tied to a gold standard, as a way to limit government's ability to manipulate the money supply and create these cycles of boom and bust.
So for Mises, it wasn't just about economic efficiency. It was about protecting individual liberty and preventing governments from becoming too powerful.
Absolutely. He saw a strong connection between economic freedom and political freedom.
Yeah.
He believed that a free market economy with limited government intervention was the best way to safeguard both individual liberty and prosperity.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the materialistic conception of history to the problem of economic calculation to the dangers of inflation and credit expansion. Mises offered a comprehensive and some might say controversial critique of Marxist thought.
Yeah.
What do you think is his most enduring legacy?
Well, I think Mises' most lasting contribution is his emphasis on the importance of individual human action as the driving force of economic and social change. He reminded us that economics is not just about abstract models and statistics. It's about real people making choices, responding to incentives, and trying to improve their lives.
That's a powerful message. It reminds us that even the most complex economic systems are ultimately the product of human choices and actions. And it underscores the importance of understanding those choices and the incentives that shape them if we want to create a more prosperous and just society.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive.
It has.
Huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through the intricacies of Mises' thought.
It's been a pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this has given you a new perspective on the enduring debate between capitalism and socialism. As always, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas and forming your own conclusions.